the air was thick with the scent of fresh earth and damp flowers. Gray clouds loomed over St. Mary's Cemetery, casting a somber shadow over the mourners gathered around the newly dug grave. The wind carried the faint whispers of condolences exchanged between distant relatives, the occasional sniffle breaking the heavy silence. Emily Carter stood among them, her hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of her black coat. She should have been crying. Everyone else was, her aunt, her uncle, even people she barely recognized from her father's past. But Emily felt numb, as if her body had disconnected from the grief that should have been coursing through her veins. Her father, James Carter, was gone. Just like that. A heart attack had stolen him away without warning, leaving her with more questions than answers. Emily hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, their conversations reduced to short, awkward phone calls during the holidays. And now, standing in front of his grave, she realized that whatever chance she had to mend their fractured relationship had died with him. A sharp bark cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Emily turned her head and saw Buddy, her father's loyal golden retriever, straining against the leash held by her Uncle Robert. The large dog whined, his golden fur damp from the light drizzle that had begun to fall. His brown eyes darted toward the casket, his body trembling with an urgency that Emily didn't understand. "He won't settle," Robert muttered, tightening his grip on the leash. "He's been like this since the wake." Emily glanced back at the polished wooden coffin that now held her father's body. The priest was speaking, his voice low and measured, but Emily barely registered his words. She only saw Buddy, his distress growing with each second. As the priest uttered the final blessings, the coffin was slowly lowered into the ground. That was when Buddy let out a long, mournful howl, a sound so raw and filled with grief that it sent a shiver down Emily's spine. A few people gasped. Others whispered among themselves. Emily felt something shift inside her. She had refused to cry, refused to let herself feel anything beyond the numbness that protected her from the weight of this loss. But Buddy had no such walls. He loved her father without hesitation, without conditions. And now, that love was breaking him. The ceremony ended soon after. People began to leave in pairs, their faces solemn as they made their way to their cars. Robert approached Emily, still struggling to keep Buddy in place. "There's something you need to see," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out an old, folded envelope with her name written in her father's familiar handwriting. Emily hesitated before taking it. "He wanted you to have this." She traced the edges of the letter with her fingers, her throat tight. Buddy sat beside her, his body pressed against her legs, offering comfort she wasn't sure she deserved. The drive back to Denver was silent except for the occasional rustling of the letter Emily had yet to open. She kept it on the passenger seat, glancing at it now and then but never mustering the courage to unfold it. What could her father possibly have written to her that he hadn't been able to say in life? In the back seat, Buddy sat with his head resting on the door, staring out at the passing landscape. Every so often, he let out a small whimper, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar environment. Emily stole a glance at him through the rearview mirror, feeling a pang of unease. She had never been a dog person. She grew up with her mother in an apartment where pets weren't allowed, while her father, after the divorce, had moved into a house outside town, where he had raised Buddy. Emily had always associated the dog with her father's life, a life she had distanced herself from. Now, Buddy was her responsibility, whether she wanted him or not. She pulled into the parking lot of her small one-bedroom apartment in downtown Denver. It was a stark contrast to the suburban home Buddy had always known. When she opened the car door, he hesitated before jumping out, his large paws landing awkwardly on the pavement. He sniffed the air, taking in the new surroundings, but his body language was tense. He was looking for something. Or someone. Inside, Emily led Buddy to the small living room. He paced around, sniffing the furniture, the walls, the corners, as if searching for her father's scent. After a few minutes, he stopped in front of the door, sat down, and refused to move. "Great," Emily muttered, rubbing her temples. She set down a bowl of water and some dry dog food that her uncle had given her, but Buddy ignored it. His eyes remained fixed on the door, ears pricked forward in expectation. He was waiting for her father to walk through. Emily let out a breath and collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion catching up to her. She reached for the letter again, running her fingers over the worn paper before finally unfolding it. Emily. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I don't know what kind of father I've been to you. I know I've made mistakes, and I won't ask you to forgive me for them. But there's one thing I need to ask of you. Take care of Buddy. He's been with me through everything. He's more than just a pet, he's family. And I think, if you let him, he might become that for you too. Love, Dad. Emily swallowed hard, staring at the words. A lump formed in her throat. She looked over at Buddy. He hadn't moved. Letting out a sigh, she stood up, grabbed a blanket, and laid it down next to the door. Fine, she murmured. You can sleep here if you want. Buddy didn't budge, but his ears flicked in acknowledgement. Emily turned off the lights and headed to bed, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than numbness. Something like guilt. Something like longing. Something like the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. The next morning, Emily awoke to the unfamiliar sound of soft whining near her bedroom door. For a moment, she forgot Buddy was there, but as soon as she stepped into the living room, she saw him, still sitting in front of the door, his head resting against the wood. He had barely moved all night. Emily sighed. You're really waiting for him, aren't you? Buddy's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't turn to look at her. Ignoring the growing tightness in her chest, she stepped into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee, staring at Buddy as he remained fixed in place. She hadn't expected him to adjust overnight, but she wasn't prepared for this level of devotion. She pulled out her phone and searched for advice on how to help grieving dogs. Maintain a routine. Give them something familiar. Offer comfort, but don't force interaction. Routine. Right. Her father used to take Buddy for morning walks. Maybe that would help. Grabbing his leash from the bag of things her uncle had given her, she approached Buddy cautiously. Come on, let's go outside. At first, Buddy didn't respond. Then, as if something in her words reminded him of his old life, he perked up slightly. When she clipped the leash onto his collar, he stood for the first time since arriving. They stepped outside into the crisp Denver morning, the sidewalks still damp from the early dew. Emily had always been a city girl. She preferred the comfort of coffee shops and bookstores, the sound of traffic rather than silence. But walking Buddy through the quiet streets felt strangely calming. For the first few blocks, Buddy kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting to see her father walking beside them. But as they reached Washington Park, a large green space filled with joggers and early risers, something in Buddy seemed to shift. His nose twitched, his ears perked up, and for the first time, his tail gave a hesitant wag. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Maybe this was a step forward. They walked in silence for a while, Buddy sniffing at the grass while Emily let her thoughts wander. It wasn't until they passed a quiet bench near the lake that she noticed Buddy suddenly freeze. What is it? She asked, following his gaze. And then she saw it, an older man sitting alone on the bench, tossing small bits of bread to the birds. Buddy's body tensed, his eyes locked onto the man with an intensity that made Emily uneasy. Before she could react, Buddy lunged forward, nearly yanking the leash from her grip. Buddy, stop! But Buddy wasn't trying to run away. His tail was wagging furiously now, his entire posture radiating excitement. The man turned at the commotion, his eyes widening slightly. Recognition flickered across his face. Well, I'll be damned, the man muttered, dropping the bread in his hand. Emily tightened her grip on Buddy's leash, trying to process what was happening. I know this dog, the man said, pushing himself up from the bench. That's James' dog, isn't it? Emily's breath caught. You knew my father? The man nodded. Knew him? Hell, I used to sit with him here every other morning. Name's Hank. Hank. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Had her father ever mentioned him? Buddy whined, pulling toward Hank, who knelt and ruffled the golden fur around his neck. "Missed me, didn't you, boy?" Emily swallowed hard. He's been acting like this since the funeral. Won't eat much. Just sits by the door all day." Hank let out a sigh. "Yeah, that sounds about right. This dog wasn't just a pet to James. Buddy was everything to him." Emily hesitated before asking, "How did they meet?" Hank gestured for her to sit on the bench. Buddy curled up at Hank's feet, finally relaxing for the first time since arriving in Denver. "Your dad got Buddy right after your mom passed," Hank said. "He wasn't doing well back then. You know, he never talked about it much, but losing her damn near broke him." Emily stiffened. She had been so wrapped up in her own grief at the time that she never stopped to wonder how her father had coped. He started coming to this park just to sit. Never said much. Just watched the lake, like he was looking for answers in the water. Hank chuckled. Then one day, this big golden fluffball comes barreling toward him, no collar, no tags, just a happy little mutt looking for attention. Your dad tried to ignore him at first, but that dog wouldn't leave his side. Emily blinked. "Wait, you mean Buddy was a stray?" "Oh yeah. Found out later someone had dumped him nearby. But that day? That dog chose your father. Sat right next to him like they'd known each other forever. And your dad, well, he never let him go after that." Emily stared down at Buddy, who now rested his head on Hank's shoe. She had never known this story. "I know you and your dad weren't close in the end," Hank said gently. "But Buddy? Buddy was his heart. If he left him to you, he must have believed you'd understand that." Emily swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She hadn't understood. Not until now. They sat there in silence for a while, the morning sun warming the chill in the air. Finally, Hank reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and folded. "I was supposed to give this to you if I ever saw you again," he said, handing it to her. It was an old, worn letter, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Her father's handwriting stared back at her. "Emily, I know I wasn't the father you needed me to be. I don't have excuses for that. But I want you to know that I thought about you every day. I wish I could have told you how proud I was. If you ever wonder why I'm leaving you, Buddy, it's because I want you to have the same chance I did. When I found him, I was lost. But he saved me. Maybe he can save you too. Love, Dad." Emily clenched the letter in her hands, her vision blurring. Buddy lifted his head, his eyes soft and knowing. For the first time in years, Emily let herself cry. The days following Emily's conversation with Hank were different. She tried not to think about it too much, but something inside her had shifted. Before, Buddy had been nothing more than an obligation, a responsibility she hadn't asked for. But now, she couldn't shake the image of her father sitting alone in the park, grieving, only for a stray dog to choose him when the world felt empty. Had she really been so blind to how much her father had needed Buddy? Buddy himself seemed lighter since the visit to the park. He no longer sat by the door all day, waiting for someone who would never return. He followed Emily around the apartment now, his tail wagging slightly when she spoke to him. He even started eating normally again. But while Buddy was beginning to heal, Emily wasn't so sure about herself. She found herself pacing her small apartment at night, unable to focus on work or sleep. She read and reread the letters her father had left behind, trying to decipher the man she had spent so much of her life resenting. And then, the job offer came. The email arrived late on a Tuesday evening, an offer from a top law firm in New York City. It wasn't unexpected. She had applied months ago, back when her life had been neatly planned out, before grief and a dog had complicated everything. This was supposed to be her dream job. A chance to start fresh, to finally step into the high-powered legal career she had always wanted. But there was one problem. No pets allowed. The thought hit her harder than it should have. She stared at the email for a long time, her mind racing. Could she even take Buddy with her? No, of course not. Not to a cramped studio apartment in New York. Not with 80-hour work weeks and barely any time for herself. It would be impossible. And wasn't that what she had wanted from the start? A way out? Emily closed her laptop, her stomach twisting. She needed to clear her head. It was late when Emily took Buddy out for a walk, the city quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. The night air was cool, crisp against her skin. Buddy trotted beside her, his leash loose in her hand. She didn't have a destination in mind, but her feet led her back to Washington Park. She sat on the same bench where she had met Hank, watching the dark waters of the lake ripple under the streetlights. Buddy sat beside her, pressing his warm body against her leg. He had no idea what was going on in her mind, no idea that she was contemplating giving him up. But maybe he did. Because when she glanced down at him, his eyes were on her, deep, knowing, waiting. Emily clenched her fists. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. Buddy let out a small whine and rested his head on her knee. Her breath hitched. Could she really do this? Could she leave him behind? The decision tormented her for days. She made lists in her head. Pros of moving to New York. Career advancement. Higher salary. Fresh start. Cons. No Buddy. It wasn't even a long list. But somehow, that one thing outweighed everything else. Emily tried to rationalize it. She even called her Uncle Robert, testing the waters. "I don't think I can keep him," she admitted, gripping the phone. "I might have to find someone else to take him." Robert sighed. "Emily, are you sure that's what you want?" She hesitated. "It's what makes sense." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's not what I asked." Emily shut her eyes. She didn't have an answer. Then, the night Buddy ran away. It was a stormy evening, the wind howling through the city streets. Rain lashed against the windows as Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the contract from the New York firm. She should have felt excitement. Relief. Instead, all she felt was an overwhelming sense of wrongness. She rubbed her temples. "What the hell is wrong with me?" And then she heard it, the sharp clang of her apartment door. She turned just in time to see Buddy's tail disappearing down the hallway. "Buddy," she shouted, scrambling to her feet. The door had been left slightly ajar, just enough for him to push through. By the time she reached the building's lobby, Buddy was gone. Panic surged through her. She ran outside, the rain drenching her in seconds. She could barely see through the downpour, but she knew where he was going. Her father's house. Her heart pounded as she sprinted down the street, her breath coming in sharp gasps. By the time she reached the old house, her clothes were soaked, her fingers numb from the cold. And there, curled up on the front porch, was Buddy. He was shivering, his golden fur slick with rain, but he didn't move when she approached. His nose was pressed against the wooden door, just like it had been that first night in her apartment. Waiting. For someone who wasn't coming back. Emily's chest ached. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his wet body. "Oh, Buddy," she whispered. "He's not here. He's gone." Buddy let out a soft whimper, tucking his head against her. Emily finally understood. Buddy wasn't just waiting for her father. He was waiting for her to come home. Not to a place, but to him. To them. To what they had left. Emily exhaled, pressing her forehead against his damp fur. "I can't leave you, can I?" Buddy didn't move. But he didn't have to. She had her answer. And for the first time in weeks, Emily finally knew what to do. She wasn't going to New York. She wasn't going to leave Buddy behind. She was staying. Because for all the mistakes she and her father had made, this wasn't going to be one of them. And as Buddy let out a deep sigh, settling against her on the porch of her father's empty house, Emily felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. For the first time since her father's passing, Emily had clarity. She wasn't leaving Buddy. She wasn't abandoning the only real connection she had left with her father. The next morning, she emailed the New York firm and turned down the job. It should have felt terrifying, giving up the opportunity she had worked for years to achieve. But as she sat on the floor of her apartment with Buddy's head resting on her lap, she realized she didn't feel regret. She felt relief. Over the next few weeks, Emily settled into a new rhythm. She worked remotely, finding freelance legal work that allowed her to stay home with Buddy. They took long walks together, visited Hank at the park, and slowly, Emily found herself letting go of the life she had thought she wanted. She didn't need a high-powered career in New York. She needed this. And then, just when she thought things were finally falling into place, everything went wrong. It started with something small. Buddy was slower than usual on their morning walk, his usual enthusiasm muted. Emily figured he was just tired, maybe a little stiff from the cooler weather. But by the afternoon, he refused to eat. Emily frowned as she placed his bowl in front of him. "Come on, Bud. You love this stuff." Buddy sniffed it half-heartedly, then turned his head away, curling up on the floor instead. A warning bell rang in Emily's mind. Buddy never skipped a meal. That night, he barely moved from his spot by the couch. His breathing was steady but shallow, and when Emily ran a hand over his golden fur, she noticed something else. He was warm. Too warm. Her heart pounded. Something was wrong. By morning, Buddy wouldn't stand up. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed her car keys, wrapped him in a blanket, and drove straight to Dr. Sarah Lawson's veterinary clinic. Sarah was one of the few vets Emily trusted. A friend of her father's, she had been Buddy's veterinarian since he was a puppy. If anyone knew what was happening, it would be her. Emily's stomach twisted as she sat in the waiting room, Buddy lying motionless on the table. His eyes fluttered open briefly, but there was no tail wag, no spark of recognition. Sarah walked in, her face kind but serious. "Emily, let's run some tests." Emily nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Sarah examined him. She checked his heart, his temperature, ran her hands gently over his stomach. Emily watched every movement, searching for a sign that it wasn't as bad as it felt. And then, Sarah's expression changed. Emily's pulse spiked. "What? What is it?" Sarah sighed, placing a gentle hand on Buddy's side. "Emily, I think it's his heart." Emily froze. "He's an older dog," Sarah continued. "I've seen this before in retrievers his age. It could be a heart condition. But we need more tests to be sure." Emily swallowed hard. "Is it?" Her voice cracked. "Is it serious?" Sarah hesitated. "We'll do everything we can." Emily looked down at Buddy, her vision blurring. She had just chosen him. She had just decided to stay. And now, she might be too late. The drive home from the vet felt endless. Emily kept glancing at Buddy, curled up in the passenger seat, his breathing slow but steady. She wasn't ready for this. She had just made the decision to stay, to build a life with him. She had chosen him. And now, fate was threatening to take him away. Sarah had told her to wait for the test results, but Emily already knew. She could see it in Buddy's tired eyes, in the way his body had slowed down. She had spent weeks thinking about her future, and now she had to accept that his time was running out. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled into the driveway. Inside, Buddy settled onto his favorite spot by the couch, letting out a soft sigh. Emily sat beside him, running her fingers through his golden fur. And then, she remembered. The last letter. She had left it sitting on her nightstand, unopened. The final words her father had left her. Her hands shook as she picked it up, carefully unfolding the worn paper. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means Buddy is still with you. And if that's the case, I need you to hear me. I know how hard it is to lose someone you love. I've been there. And I know you don't want to hear this, but one day, you'll have to say goodbye to him too. When that time comes, don't run from it. Don't shut yourself away. Let yourself feel it. Because love, real love, doesn't disappear just because someone is gone. It stays with you, even after they leave. You are always strong, Emily. Stronger than me. Take care of Buddy. And when the time comes, let him go with love. I love you, kid. Dad. Emily pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing. Her father had known. He had known this moment would come. And even now, even in death, he was still trying to guide her through it. She looked down at Buddy, his eyes barely open, but still watching her, always watching her. She wiped her tears. She wasn't going to waste the time they had left. The next few days were filled with small moments of joy. She took Buddy back to Washington Park, where they sat on her father's old bench, watching the lake together. She cooked his favorite meals, forgetting about the dog food, letting him have whatever he wanted. She lay beside him at night, whispering stories about her childhood, about her father, about all the things she wished she had said before it was too late. And Buddy listened, like he always had. One evening, as the sun set behind the Denver skyline, Buddy pressed his nose against her palm one last time. And then, he was gone. Emily held him close, her heart breaking, but she didn't run from it. She let herself feel every second of it. Because love doesn't disappear. And she would carry him, just like she carried her father. Always. The house felt empty without Buddy. For weeks, Emily woke up expecting to hear the soft patting of his paws on the hardwood floor, the familiar weight of his presence beside her. But the apartment was silent now, too silent. She kept reaching for his leash before realizing there was no morning walk to take. She still found herself hesitating at the pet food aisle in the grocery store, before remembering she didn't need to buy kibble anymore. Grief clung to her like a second skin. But she didn't fight it. She let herself feel. She took long walks alone, retracing the steps she and Buddy had taken through Washington Park. She visited Hank, who always had a knowing look in his eyes but never pushed her to talk. And at night, when the weight of loss was too much, she would reread her father's letters, his words a reminder that love didn't vanish, it simply changed form. Then, one afternoon, she got a call from Dr. Sarah Lawson. "There's something I think you should see," Sarah said over the phone. "Come by the clinic when you have time." Curious, Emily made her way to the small veterinary office, not sure what to expect. When she arrived, Sarah was waiting for her near the back, a soft smile on her face. And then Emily saw them. A litter of golden retriever puppies, no more than a few weeks old, curled up together in a large crate. They were abandoned, Sarah explained. "We're looking for foster homes." Emily felt something stir in her chest, something that had been dormant since Buddy passed. She knelt down, hesitantly reaching out. The puppies tumbled over each other, their tails wagging wildly. One of them, a small one with a slightly darker patch of fur on his ear, stumbled toward her. Emily scooped him up, cradling him against her chest. He was warm, soft, his tiny heartbeat pulsing against her own. Something inside her cracked open. Sarah watched her carefully. "You don't have to decide right now," she said gently. But Emily already knew. She looked down at the puppy, at his bright, trusting eyes, and felt the first true spark of hope since Buddy had left. She smiled. "I think I'm ready." Spring had arrived in Denver, painting the city in soft hues of green and gold. Emily sat on her father's old bench in Washington Park, watching the lake shimmer under the afternoon sun. But this time, she wasn't alone. The small golden retriever puppy, whom she had named Charlie, sat beside her, chewing on a stray leaf, his tiny tail wagging as he gnawed playfully. He was different from Buddy, but in the best way. Where Buddy had been calm and steady, Charlie was energetic and mischievous, tumbling over his own paws as he explored the world. And yet, in the way he looked up at her, in the way he pressed close when she sighed, she saw traces of Buddy, too. She had spent so long fearing loss, fearing love itself. But now, as Charlie curled up against her leg, she finally understood. Love was never meant to be held in place. It was meant to move, to grow, to be shared. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Well, I'll be damned," Hank said, walking up with his usual slow, steady gait. He eyed Charlie with a smirk. "Didn't take you long, did it?" Emily smiled, running a hand through the puppy's soft fur. "I wasn't planning on it," she admitted. "But then I saw him, and I just knew." Hank nodded, sinking onto the bench beside her. "Funny how that happens." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching joggers and families pass by, listening to the distant sound of laughter. Then Hank turned to her, his gaze serious. "So, what's next for you?" Emily took a deep breath. She had spent so much time chasing things she thought she needed: a high-powered job, a fresh start, a future that didn't feel tied down. But she didn't want to run anymore. "I've been thinking about it," she admitted. "I'm going to stay in Denver. Keep working remotely, maybe even do something meaningful with it. I was looking into therapy dog programs. Buddy helped my dad through so much. Maybe Charlie can do the same for someone else." Hank grinned. "Now that's a damn fine idea." Emily smiled, feeling something settle inside her. She reached into her bag and pulled out her father's last letter, running her fingers over the creased paper. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what it said. "Love doesn't disappear. It just changes form." She leaned down, scratching behind Charlie's ears as he gazed up at her, eyes full of trust. "Come on, buddy," she murmured. "Let's go home." And this time, she knew exactly where that was.